Thank you. It's very, very nice to be here. I fell in love with South Carolina the first time I came about, I don't know, maybe 7, 8 years ago. I went to Charleston, and I've been charmed by the state ever since. So I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you for hosting me. The title of my talk this evening is America Divided, the Left, the Right, and the Contemporary Political Landscape. And the starting point of the talk is the most hackneyed cliched of them all, namely, we are a divided nation. But we're so divided, in fact, that we don't even agree on the nature of the divisions. So take the greatest division we've ever had in American history, the Civil War. It was pretty clear what the sides were. There was the North and there was the South. And it was pretty clear what the disagreement was. It was slavery. Today, by contrast, if you listen to different voices on the left and on the right, you get very different accounts. Say you were to ask Bernie Sanders, right, who mounted a formidable challenge to Hillary Clinton in the last election and who garnered $6 million in the first 24 hours that he announced that he was going to run again in 2020. What, according to him, is the nature of the divide? It's who versus who. Or should I say maybe whom versus whom? Class. How do you define class? What kind of class?
One based on economics.
Exactly. How much you earn. The 1% versus the 99%. The rich versus the rest of America. Speaking of percentages, had you spoken to Mitt Romney in 2012, how old are you guys? You remember? I know things move very quickly, and there's like after Trump and before Trump, and before Trump we seem to have forgotten. What did Romney say was the divide in remarks that dealt a pretty serious blow to his campaign? What percentage versus what percentage? Anyone remember? Yes?
Well, there was 47% of Americans don't pay any income taxes.
So the takers versus the makers, the 53% who do. But we don't just disagree about percentages. Say you were to listen to a Donald Trump speech. What's the divide there? It's the American people. He's actually revived a phrase from FDR, out of all people, the greatest democratic president of the 20th century. He speaks of the forgotten men and women of this country on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you get the elites. You get the ruling class. You get the bigs. Big media, big corporations, big government, they're all rotten. If you speak to Kamala Harris, or to pretty much most progressive intellectuals, the divide is quite different. On the one hand, you find women, people of color, the LGBTQ, versus, well, if you're running for president, you don't say the versus part because that's imprudent politically. But if you go into the academy or you read journals or you read the New York Times, they don't mince words. It's white men. It's the patriarchy. That's the divide. So which is it? Are we divided by race, by sex, by sexual orientation, by class, maybe a combination of them all? And if it's class, to go back to the question I posed to you, how do you define class? Is it how much you make? Is it where you live? Is it whether or not you went to college? Is it how you view the world? We just don't agree. And what I propose tonight is not to tell you who's right, in part because I don't have the answer, and I think this is a rather difficult question. I will say that I am, to make it provocative and to make it interesting, I am very sympathetic to Trump's diagnosis. I'm not here to defend and bless every last tweet, blunder, or misspoken word, but I do think that there's definitely something that we can learn from the diagnosis, but you're of course free to disagree with me. And as you'll notice too, these divisions it's not just left versus right. They cut through the left, and then they cut through the right, and then there's some overlap, because Bernie Sanders is a populist, but then so is Donald Trump, but they're different kinds of populists. Now, at the end of the day, the left is much more unified than the right. In no small part because Donald Trump did a semi-hostile takeover of the Republican Party. I say that it's semi-hostile because the electorate and the grassroots conservative movement generally supported Trump or got around to supporting him. The Republican establishment and conservative intellectuals did not. You may remember that the Never Trump movement didn't come from the left, it came from the right. It's National Review that published the Never Trump issue. Things have gotten somewhat better since then, Some more and more conservative intellectuals have warmed up to Trump, but the divisions remain, and there are some very, very interesting debates taking place in Washington today. And this is what I want to lay out for you and then open it up to questions and see what you think. So the way I propose to deal with it is to begin by looking at the left and the Democratic Party. And there, the two big ideological currents you see are identity politics and then traditional progressivism, for lack of a better word. And I'll unpack what they mean. And then we'll turn to the right and to the Republican Party. And there I think the big tension is between mainstream fusionist conservatism on the one hand, and then Trump's brand of populist nationalism. Sounds good? So let's begin on the left. And there I think we need to begin with identity politics because it is the most powerful ideology in America today. It permeates our culture. It fuels this national obsession we have in America with diversity, understood as the proportional representation in all realms of all recognized, marginalized, oppressed identity groups. So you know the roster. There are African Americans, there are women, there are Hispanics, there is the LGBTQ community. We were supposed to get Minas. Anyone know what a Mina is? That would have been good for me. My dad was born in Morocco. Minas are Middle Easterners and North Africans. But that didn't work out under the Census Bureau, so we don't count them for now. And the idea is you then look at all realms of life, say higher education, Congress, Fortune 500 companies, I don't know, Nobel laureates, and you want to more or less see, so 51%, I don't know, 4%, 13, oh, I forgot Asians, Americans, I think it's about 5%, and then you expect more or less to find proportional representation everywhere. I can't help but point out that it's interesting which communities we decide to recognize and which we don't. I think you could make a pretty solid argument that Mormons have been horribly mistreated throughout American history, and yet for some reason we're not concerned about whether or not they're proportionally represented in all these realms. But I digress. The reason I say it's the most powerful ideology in America is because it is the only one that has the power to silence other people. In America today, you can criticize the welfare state as much as you want. You can criticize the right. You can criticize Christianity. You can burn the flag, urinate on the Constitution. It may be of poor taste. There's not going to be calls for you to be fired, and you're not going to have your name forever besmirched on the internet. The way to be fired and to have your life ruined is if you deviate from the accepted script in speaking of one of the protected, recognized identity groups. You just need to say something that someone finds offensive on their behalf. So you may remember the brouhaha with the Washington Redskins, where I'm from. It was not Native Americans who thought that it was offensive that the team was called the Redskins. It was elite liberals who took offense on their behalf. So you just need to say something that deviates from that script, and then the knives come out for you. We thankfully in America do not criminalize hate speech. We are, I believe, the only Western nation not to do so. However, our friends in Silicon Valley have taken the lead in addressing the problems themselves by deplatforming, demonetizing. What's the other one where they rig the search results so that your name doesn't show up? Shadow banning. To police hate speech. We do have laws on the books, though, of course, adding extra punishment if you commit a hate crime. And as a result, I would say, the fear of identity politics lives within all of us. Everyone knows what you're not allowed to say. And the point I want to be clear is not to say malicious things and slanders and to be mean-spirited. It's just to say something that the left takes offense at, and then it's over for you. One thing I want to clarify, which I touched upon, is that this term identity politics is deeply misleading because it would imply that it's a politics of identity. So a lot of people claim, oh, we used to have a politics of class, then sometimes in the 70s we shifted to a politics of identity. So basically, identity politics is tribalism. But that's not true, because identity politics is a politics of oppression first and foremost. And only those who have an identity that they claim is oppressed are entitled to be proud of that identity. That's why, for example, you do not see men, whites, Christians as part of recognized identity groups. It goes without saying in America that we have a congressional black caucus, we have a Hispanic caucus. We do not have a Caucasian congressional caucus. You're laughing. You know that you couldn't, because these are oppressor identities, and you can't be proud of them. You need to perpetually atone for the sins of the father. So basically what identity politics is identity for some and not for others, or rather two kinds of identities. The identities of the oppressed, the traditionally marginalized and stigmatized, those we celebrate, we elevate, we promote, and then the identities of those who belong to oppressor groups, primarily men and white people, in which case there's not only no pride, they need to be silenced, atone for the sins of the father, apologize constantly. And this, I would argue, in a minus the edge, kind of the anti-white, anti-male animus, is the dominant center, the fire in the Democratic Party today. I think the main concern of the Democratic Party is to help these traditionally marginalized and stigmatized communities. It's not the only one. We're going to get to the second part of it. But I think this is where the energy is. This is where the passion is. This is why there have been many more stories about hate crimes than there are about, say, the way that Amazon treats its workers in its factories. Because we focus on these groups of victims, not others. That's where the fire is. Occasionally, the ugly side of this shows up. Do you remember Hillary's most infamous comment in the 2016 election? What did she say? What is that a dog whistle for, to use a term that the left accuses the right of? Who is she referring to? Yeah. So here you get one really, really interesting tension on the left. What do you do with the working class, which is not exclusively white, of course, but a large chunk of it is white? If you're Bernie Sanders, if you're Elizabeth Warren, you have sympathy for them because they're being oppressed by the 1%, the rich, big corporations. But if you practice identity politics, you're like, a lot of white people here. Why would you have sympathy for them? They're part of the problem. A lot of men here. They're not worthy of any sympathy. So one tension you see, it's not an enormous one, but it is there on the left and in the Democratic Party, is how much sympathy do you have for people who are not faring well, but are not so lucky as to have their identity recognized? Which brings me to, I guess I'll draw, this was identity politics. The other big strand on the left and in the Democratic Party is kind of old school progressivism. And I'd say the embodiment of this today is Bernie Sanders. Now, it is interesting to note that Bernie Sanders is he's not a Democrat. He's an independent, which says something about the Democratic Party. He's not the only one. I think that Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are very much in this way of looking at things. And you're familiar with this. This is basically traditional class-based politics. You've got the poor, the working class, the middle class, the 99%. This was Occupy Wall Street, which petered out eventually. And then you've got the 1%, the rich, the corporations, and they're taking advantage of them. And the point is basically to do three things. One is to tax these people heavily. Two is to have wealth transfers to the working class and the middle class. And three is to heavily regulate and police corporate America to make sure that they're not screwing over the workers and polluting the environment. Now, this gets called socialism. Any of you here have read Marx? Do we still read Marx? What would Marx say about, I don't know, Bernie Sanders' agenda? Would he say, yes, this is socialism? No. Socialism is meant to be the intermediary stage between capitalism and communism. And what happens in that intermediary stage? The state controls the means of production. You abolish the private sector, you take it over. This is liberalism. So Sanders calls it democratic socialism. It's basically, no, you still get to have a private sector. If there is one lesson that the left learned in the 20th century is that communism doesn't work. You keep markets except for these three big things. You tax very heavily at the top, you redistribute a lot and have a lot of entitlements and welfare programs. And actually, the big push here, if you think about it, we in America, if you look at our welfare state, we have nothing to be ashamed of vis-a-vis Sweden when it comes to the elderly and the poor. The difference between America and Europe is we don't have major middle-class entitlements. And this is where the push is. Paid leave, Medicare for all. We already take care of the elderly. We already take care of the poor. They want to take care of everyone else. And then the third one here is this deep distrust of corporate America, which, by the way, is a second difference with identity politics. People who practice identity politics are kind of okay with corporate America so long as you do diversity hiring and you kind of do some social justice advertising. And then they leave you alone. These guys are not satisfied with that. There is a deep and abiding distrust of corporate America. So I mentioned that there's a dearth of stories of how Amazon is treating its workers. The Nation, which is an old school progressive journal, which was founded by, who founded The Nation? No, Herbert Crowley founded, he founded the New Republic, that's it. I don't remember who, that's what I was thinking. Okay, I don't remember who founded The Nation. They had a really long, very interesting essay on all the ways in which Amazon is not a good corporation. And they weren't taken in by the fact that Amazon has a chief diversity officer and that they have this many women in the C-suite. They were just looking at how they're treating the workers. Now, I point out these two tensions. I don't want to exaggerate them because on most days, these two ways of looking at the world cohabit on the left and in the Democratic Party. If you listen to, the average Democratic Party stump speech, it'll say, here's what I'm going to do for the working class, a $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all. I'm going to raise taxes. I'm going to help the poor. I'm going to take care of those who only have $400 in savings. And then I'm going to do this for the LGBTQ, this for women, this for African Americans, this for Hispanics, this for Asians, and we all get along and we move on. There are these two tensions that I want you to be aware of, but on the whole, the two cohabit rather well. Is this clear on the left before we turn to the right? Any questions about this before we proceed? Okay, so let's see what is happening on the right. Let me point out maybe actually one last little thing, since I am a political scientist. One interesting thing you see here is, if you look at it in terms of government, here is where you get the welfare state. It is also, I would distinguish it from the administrative state. And I would say the welfare state is about wealth transfers. The administrative state is about regulating the private sector to protect workers, Americans, and the environment. And then out of identity politics, you get what I would call the anti-discrimination state, which really begins with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Title VII gives the federal government the power to police the private sector, the corporate sector in particular, but not only that, universities, to eradicate discrimination. You also get into affirmative action, government, racial preferences in government contracting, extra penalties for hate crimes. And then, the big missing piece here, as I mentioned, is criminalizing hate speech. I gotta say, I am not particularly worried about this in America anytime soon because we have a First Amendment And just recently, there was a case before the Supreme Court involving an Asian American rock band called the Slants. And the Copyright Office refused to issue a copyright for their band name on the ground that it was hate speech. They said, no, it's ironic. They sued, and I believe it was 8-0 that the Supreme Court sided with them. But that said, you should be aware that it may not be happening via the state. It is happening in the private sector, and it's something we ought to be mindful of. So you kind of have these two different big strands of the left have built up these three different states, which really together constitute the modern administrative welfare anti-discrimination state. So let's look at the right now. I think the dominant way of thinking, and by the way, I'm not going to get into, I could go more granular, but there's only so much time and it's an intro talk and I'm eager to get to your question. So I want to keep it at a macro level. I think the dominant way of looking at things on the right in America and in the Republican Party is mainstream fusionist conservatism. Have you guys heard of the three-legged stool? Anyone heard this term? So Meyer is the one who wrote the book on fusionism. He wanted to unify the libertarians with the traditionalists to defeat the common enemy of communism. That's where, I don't know if he coined the term fusionism, but he's the one, I guess, who popularized it. By the three-legged stool, I mean, on economic questions, what's the position you take? Basically the libertarian one. Less government, more freedom, lower taxes, less regulation, let the private sector grow. Cut spending, cut taxes, it grows. No to tariffs, no to heavy regulations, inject energy into the private sector. That is coupled with social conservatism, which basically grows out of a series of Supreme Court decisions in the 1970s that start to touch life, religious liberty, and then also the sexual revolution. And the traditional priorities have really been life, religious liberty, and marriage. Now, marriage, the social conservatives lost, and it's kind of a dead letter at this point. So the focus is really on life and on religious liberty. And then what's the third one? Yeah, so I don't know of let's call it an assertive foreign policy. I don't want to use pejorative terms because I want you to understand these things. If you want it to be pejorative, you would call it interventionist, you'd call it neoconservative. It's an assertive foreign policy. I don't like this term interventionist as if intervening is an end unto itself. No, you intervene on behalf of something, America's interest, and then the disagreement is over how do you define America's interest. But traditionally, mainstream American conservatism, especially in recent decades, has been for a pretty assertive foreign policy, which means on the one hand, a very well-funded Pentagon, and then also an America that has a large role to play all over the world. This, I think, is the way that most think tanks in Washington speak. It definitely is the way we speak at the Heritage Foundation. And it's the way that your average Republican member of Congress speaks. This is, what does it mean to be a conservative? It means a combination of these three things. One thing I would point out is, though, in terms of the heart and soul of the movement, this one looms much larger than the other two. The default rhetorical setting on the right is more liberty, less government. That is what conservatives in America are most comfortable with. And this explains, by the way, why the social conservatives are always on the defensive. Because if the point of life is to maximize liberty and for consenting adults to do whatever they want, well then why are we criminalizing prostitution? Why don't we legalize drugs? Oh no, but it's different. Why? I understand. You just said that government is bad. Oh, no, well, here it's good. And so there's this perennial tension because the heart, the soul, the rhetoric has been decisively shaped by the libertarians. So you mentioned Frank Meyer. It turns out that in this fusionist alliance, it's one side that has had much more influence than the other. I mean, who still reads Russell Kirk today? Whereas Hayek and this way of thinking and speaking is the biggest one. Now, I do want to point out one important thing. They may talk this way, but when it comes time to governing, the average member of Congress who's a Republican is not governing this way. We've had a century of progressive liberalism in America. The left controls all of the major organs of power in America that bestow praise or blame. They're at the commanding heights of society. The average member of Congress who's a Republican has come to define conservatism as whatever the left want except maybe 20% less of it, or whatever the left wanted 20 years ago. There is some truth, I think, to Robert Louis Dabney's biting observation that conservatism is but the shadow that follows radicalism as it moves forward towards perdition. That they may talk a good game, but oftentimes they're on the defensive and they're not too sure what to do, so they end up saying, well, whatever the guys want, just maybe a little bit less of it. So this is, I'd say, the dominant way of looking at things. Let's call it fusionist conservatism. And then, and I'll end with this, there's the newest kid on the block, President Trump. And or you could actually say Trumpism, which is what we want to look at. I don't want to look at the quirks and eccentricities of Donald Trump. I want to look at the underlying worldview, and I do think there is one. It's not unique to him, by the way. Pat Buchanan was basically Trump avant la lettre in many regards. Not entirely so. I mean, Buchanan is a pious Catholic, and I think is much more socially conservative than Trump is. But it's not like Trump invented this. I would define this using two terms that are controversial, so I'll explain to you what they mean, and then we'll open it up to questions. I think it's a combination of populism and nationalism. What do I mean by that? So, populism I just take to mean a way of looking at the country that says that the fundamental division is between the people broadly construed and the ruling class in power. The bigs, as I mentioned, big media, big corporations, big government, that they form a unified class and that they are characterized by two things. One, they advance policies that benefit them at the expense of the American people, immigration policies, for example, trade policies, for example, taxation policies, for example, and then second, that they have contempt for ordinary Americans, that they look down upon them, that they, to quote President Barack Obama, are ashamed that these people cling to their guns and their religion. And populism is, what Trump is saying is, I am wholly on the side in this conflict of the American people. Now, Trump, of course, doesn't come from the American people. He's a billionaire from New York who went to Wharton. He's a class traitor. He has turned against this class and he says, I am championing the interest. As I said, it's very interesting, by the way, that a Republican is sounding like FDR and is saying the forgotten men and women of this country. I want to highlight the difference between this kind of populism and Sanders's. If you make $47,000 a year and you went to Sarah Lawrence College and you're blogging for the New York Times about gender issues, according to Bernie Sanders, you're part of the 99%. According to this worldview, you're part of the ruling class. You may not have as much money, but you share their worldview. You share their prejudices. By contrast, say you make $5 million a year selling used cars in Omaha, and you go to church every Sunday, and you got a lot of guns at home. According to Bernie Sanders, and he's right, you are a 1%er. According to this worldview, you're not a 1%er. You're part of the American people because you don't feel at home in elite American culture and you feel that you are despised. So in this contest, populism in the Trumpist sense is wholly on the side of the American people. And then we'll end with this term, an even more controversial one, nationalism. It can mean a variety of things. It can be aspirational. So where I'm from in Quebec, they took 2 cracks at it. They have yet to succeed. They want their own country. Everyone likes this. I have yet to hear anyone in polite society criticize the South Sudanese, the East Timorians, the Quebecois, the Catalan if they want their own country. This kind of nationalism we all love. The reason the term is loaded is because it can mean another thing. It can mean blood and soil nationalism of the Third Reich variety, aimed at expanding the nation and purifying the race. Or it can mean something else. And I think what it means for Trump is, here is, you'll excuse my poor drawing of America, I'm a Canadian. If you don't like this, try to come draw Canada. Well, this is not really, I could do better. Okay, let's try. Is that better? Okay. This kind of nationalism says, you either have a country or you don't, you either have borders or you don't. You can have as many sub-identities as you want, you can have endless varieties of hyphenated Americans. We need to have a primary identity, and that's American. And it's a way of pushing back against two other forces that are undermining the primacy of the nation state. One is at the subnational level, and that is identity politics, that in effect says, no, we don't have a country. We have these various communities, and that your primary allegiance is to your ethnic, sexual, whatever identity group is. The other thing it pushes back on would be, I'd say, the excesses of globalism. The idea that we are citizens of the world. That, yeah, I mean, you live now here in South Carolina, but you could then move to Paris and then go to Singapore. There's a British journalist who wrote a book that now eludes me, and he came up, I thought, with a pretty clever distinction to try to explain what has been happening in the West in the past 20 years. And he says there's a difference between the anywheres and the somewheres. The anywheres are people who can practice their jobs anywhere in the world. If you have an MBA from Wharton and you start off at a big bank in Manhattan, you can then go to Singapore, you can go to Paris, you can go to London. But yeah, you can feel American, but you are part of the integrated global economy. However, you know, if you own a dry cleaner in rural Ohio, yeah, you can't just move and pack up and leave and reinvent yourself in another country the next day. You're not as plugged into the global economy. And I take this variety of nationalism to be what is primary is the nation state. Of course, we're part of a global world order. We have allies. We trade with them. But we do so in a way where we watch out first and foremost for the well-being of our citizens. And of course, we have diversity in America. Americans worship a variety of gods, and they disagree about how to worship the same God. They have different skin colors. They express themselves differently. They live in different parts of the country. But there has to be something that unites us all. And I think that this variety of nationalism is not an attempt to recreate the Third Reich in America. It's not an attempt to bring white nationalism to America. It's an attempt to reassert the primacy of the nation state against, on the one hand, the dissolving forces of identity politics, and on the other hand, the dissolving forces of, I guess, the excesses of globalization. And right now, it is an open question which way the Republican Party will go and which way the right will go. I will end by quoting my favorite American philosopher, Yogi Berra, who once said, "I hate making predictions, especially about the future. I don't know how this will play out. What I do know is that you are lucky to live at a time when it is so interesting to follow politics." It's exhausting too, because, I mean, the news media here is just exhausting. And it's an endless series of scandals, and then you move on and there's never any follow-up. Like what happened to Las Vegas? Who did it? No, we've moved on to something. No one knows. We moved on. Smollett will be forgotten next week. They'll find something else. That said, beneath the constant hysteria, there are some very, very big questions being debated. Some very interesting debates taking place. I'll end by just pointing out a really big one, which is the tension between this and this. So, of course, you know, Trump, he cut taxes, he deregulates, he's from the private sector, he thinks business is good. But is he opposed to big government if big government is helping the American people? Is he fiscally conservative? Is he a limited government kind of guy? No. The right is, and you're seeing some huge, I mean, they're not big fights now, they're just fascinating debates taking place on the right between the traditional libertarian wing, the economists, and this growing movement here of people who are doing what I would call political economy. My friend Oren Cass, who works at the Manhattan Institute, just published a very interesting book called The Once and Future Worker. You're seeing these debates over these guys, and by the way, Cass is not a Trumpist, but he has this sympathy for the working class. They are much more open to the idea that the government can do a bunch of things to help the working class, whereas the libertarian wing of the right is not. I'll end on this note and open it up to questions. I'm going to need to repeat your question. Oh. I need to repeat the question? Okay, so try to keep it short, so I need to repeat it for whoever is watching on the YouTubes.
So I know most of the questions are going to be about current America, but I was wondering what you thought about more particularly nationalism and the Civil War. You mentioned Dabney, so I'm not sure if you've thought about, like, if you spent any time studying that period. If you haven't, that's okay. But I was just wondering, like, what you might think about just nationalism, Civil War, like how that might have played a factor in that.
Well, I mean, okay, so I'm in the South, and I'm at John Calhoun's college, so even though I am not a Calhounite, and I am an unrepentant unionist and a Lincolnian, I do want to be gracious to my hosts. I do not buy the line that the Civil War was about states' rights. It was about slavery. It was about not being happy with the result of an election. After the war, it was repackaged as the noble lost cause to defend a traditional way of life. Let's just not talk about slavery, just ignore it as if it wasn't foundational to the aristocratic ethos of the South. And let's make it about states' rights. I just don't buy that. What I will say is that the country was deeply, deeply divided at the time. There was a fundamental disagreement over you had two regimes, basically. You had a commercial republic in the north and an aristocratic republic in the south. One side scorned labor, the other exalted it. One was an oligarchy, the other wasn't. And so something had to give, and it did give. I will point out, my favorite place in Washington is the Lincoln Memorial, and when you go there, you can read the second inaugural address, which he delivers in '64, 3 years into the Civil War, and he says in there, we both pray to the same God. And, I'll just point out that at the time, they had an enormous division, but they still prayed to the same God. Today, we don't pray to the same God anymore. Now, thankfully, we're not killing each other. No, I think it's worth pointing this out because the country is divided. The rhetoric is very heated, but we haven't had the kind of political violence, thankfully, that we had in America in the 60s, for example. And I pray to God we won't. So it's maybe good to remember some history to realize that it is pretty bad today, but it's been much worse. Yes?
Two questions, because he had an interesting point. One, how much do you think the difference between, say, the Civil War and the 1960s and now is a matter of regionalism, in the sense of in the 1860s it was relatively divided by the North thought one thing, the South thought another, but now we live amongst each other and that interplay making it different?
So I think the division today is partially geographic, but it's more of the major urban centers that are connected to the global economy and the hinterland. This term that I find horrifying, and yet that is in common use in America, flyover country, versus the major urban centers. I think that is a meaningful divide, and it has to do with the fact that, as I said, the urban centers are connected to the global economy. And large parts of the hinterland and of the rest of the country are not as much. And that's why I said initially, I don't know who's right, and I don't think any one of these schools there's a single explanation for all of the divisions. It's pretty complicated. There is a geographical dimension to it. And what was your second question?
So with regards to populism and economic libertarian, is there an attempt to kind of fuse the two? Or are there people that are split between the two, and how do they approach it? Or is that an either-or dichotomy?
I mean, I don't think it is, in the sense of it's not like these people are socialists and statists and they want 5-year plans and they want to nationalize the means of production and they don't believe in the free market. Tucker Carlson gave this monologue 6 weeks ago that just erupted. And I don't know, I live in the DC bubble, which I realize is not reality, right? DC is 64 square miles surrounded by reality. So in DC, that's all that everyone talked about for 10 days. I don't know if anyone talked about it in the rest of the country. It's not like the people who are in favor of this more populist approach to economics on the right don't see the wonders of markets. They're kind of rejecting the claim that you either believe in free markets or you don't. They want to open up the discussion of, yes, I believe in markets. Let's think through, when should the state intervene in markets? And the main concern here is, obviously there's agreement about health and safety, that you shouldn't sell dangerous products. The main agreement here is, what do you do with the labor market? These people are basically saying the labor market is not a market like any other market because the supply is inelastic. They're called your fellow American citizens. They're not as mobile as capital, as goods and services, as plants. And work is absolutely foundational to the health of the regime. Because if people don't find work, they don't turn out well. Men in particular absolutely need to have access to jobs that allow them to be marriageable. And that if the economy is not producing such jobs, we have a problem. That they're basically saying the point of the economy is not to maximize efficiency. It is not to maximize growth. These things matter. You need to be very much aware of the libertarian critique of interventions, that good intentions are not enough, regulatory capture, public choice theory, but you need to realize that it may be necessary to take a hit on efficiency in order to better serve the common good. That's the disagreement. And it's a really interesting one. Yes, young man.
In reflecting on something you said very much earlier about Silicon Valley, it seems like during America, and for most political theory, the dominant relationship is between a people and a government. And
how so? What do you mean by that?
In a sense that political theory basically focuses on the order that a government provides to a society, and without it, the anarchy that would reign. And it seems today as if there is a third player, or at least one that's unique in its vocation now, similar to maybe the whole Roman Empire, which is Silicon Valley. Just in the sense that if our government collapsed today, we'd obviously have anarchy. But if all of our technology fell apart today, there would be some equal state of unrest and dissolution. So I'm curious to hear whether you think all of these schools of thought have to adapt in some modern context to take into account the overriding influence that social media, that the internet, that modern technology have on people that doesn't seem to have occurred, at least in America previously.
Yeah, the answer is yes. And I don't know what the answer is to that, in part because I don't think any of these groups have sufficiently thought through what the internet has done to our lives. I mean, take the example of pornography. We now have the greatest delivery mechanism for pornography ever known to man. So an unlimited supply of free, anonymous, the hardest possible sex you can imagine. Who talks about this? What this does to the character of the regime? What this does to marriage? I mean, a handful of weird academics do. This is not part of the debate. And regardless of what you think ought to be done about it, you would think that a responsible society would have interesting debates about what this is doing to the character of the society. There aren't any that I know of. And so you could multiply. I mean, we have some talk about social media. Do you have real friends, but when you need to move, none of your Facebook friends show up? Are we spending too much time on our screens? There is some awareness of that. There's some awareness that Silicon Valley is a problem and a bit different than the rest of the corporate sector in America. But I haven't seen a proper reckoning and thinking through of these things, which I think is problematic. Young man.
So you spoke about how the nation-state identity is trying to be reestablished, to be to be anti-globalist and anti-identity politics. My question to you is, do you think that sometime in the future there can be an international political order?
No. I mean, we have...
Okay, how about an international economic order in which labor would not be sacrificed? In which like...
So I spoke
there
to...
could still be meaning in labor, and this would be... I'm envisioning a future where most of the labor that is done, like hard, like working class labor, wouldn't need to be done because of capital and technology. Do you see an international economic community that...
But you're asking two different questions. One is, you seem to be asking, is technology going to render manual labor redundant? And the other one, you seem to be saying, can we create an integrated global economy in which labor, goods, and services flow and are not interrupted by artificial political barriers?
Yeah.
Okay, so these are two separate questions. You guys are asking hard questions. Can I get an easy one after this, maybe? On the first front, machines are very good at doing routine work, whether manual or intellectual. They are not good at doing non-routine work. One big question right now before us is, what is driving? Which category does it fall under? 7% of driving. So the drive I did from the airport to here, from the moment I got on the highway until the moment I got on the Clemson campus, a machine could have done that. But then what do you do about that 1 or 2%? Are machines going to be capable of doing that? I really don't know. I am not a technology expert. I don't know. But it gives me some pause. You know, there are some people who make it sound machines are going to do everything. They don't have a very good track record of doing non-routine labor, whether intellectual or manual. So this gives me some pause. Regarding the second question of, having a global economic order, look, to some extent we do. I mean, the post-World War II global order is a pretty impressive achievement in terms of, I don't know enough about the GATT and the WTO and the IMF. I mean, there are a variety of agreements that regulate trade. Tariffs are down across the board. I just don't think we can and should want to live in a world in which the nation state is not the basic political unit. You've got two alternatives to the nation state politically: the polis, the city-state, or the empire. The polis has something appealing about it. I just don't see it happening in the modern world. And so if you're not going to have the nation state in the modern world, you'll end up with an empire, and you will not have citizens, and you will not have democracy. You will have some form of a technocratic government in which we are subjects of a perhaps benign administrative state, but you won't have citizens. Yes? Easy one? No?
Maybe. So, going back to identity politics, do you think...
Okay, not easy.
Do you think that there is a way to reinstate kind of a manifestation of individuality in the face of the identity politics that have taken over our culture and our legislation? Do you think there's a way for either the right or the left or anyone to reinstate individuality and a personal responsibility?
Yes, but I want to make clear that, look, human beings are tribal by nature. I don't think there's anything wrong in a free country if Jews want to live in a Jewish neighborhood and send their kids to Jewish school. And if, the Ecuadorians, especially recent arrivals who don't know the country well, are more comfortable settling in an Ecuadorian neighborhood in which there are restaurants that will remind them of their country. I mean, it's a free country. We should be allowed to associate with whom we want. All I'm saying is, one is we should put a premium on assimilation, integration, stirring things together, cultivating a shared national identity. But I don't think it's possible to think that we should obliterate, and should even want to obliterate, these various cultural ethnic identities. I think it would be inhuman. What you want is, over time, for many of them to kind of tamp down. But even there, look, in a free country, we can have people like the Amish, who really live wholly apart. I mean, they don't speak English. They live in their own towns. They don't pay Social Security taxes. I don't remember how, I think they went all the way to the Supreme Court to get an exemption from that. Now, could we have a country full of comparable communities? No, then you would no longer have a country. But in a country as vast as America, if some groups want to basically exit, I think we can tolerate them. What you can't have is the kind of the balkanizing forces of these large tribes who start all fighting for a slice of the pie, wanting more power, and no longer emphasize the unity. So I'm all for, individual rights, and you get to, by the way, in America, you get to leave these communities. We don't punish apostasy. You get to convert it out of whatever religion you were born in. You get to marry who you want. So if you're not happy with the identity you're born into, you get to leave it. But I don't think it's feasible nor desirable to want to eradicate all of these ethnic identities. But what you want to prevent is people not looking outside of their ethnic community and remembering that there are other fellow American citizens. Yes, young man with the blue shirt.
So you mentioned earlier about how on the social front, the right has the conservatives have sort of conceded the issue of marriage.
Well, they've just lost.
Right, they just lost.
I mean,
my question is on the economic front. Do you think that the conservatives are in danger of potentially conceding to more government intervention in the market with the advent of companies like Amazon? Because even Tucker Carlson has said, I don't know about corporate welfare, and he was in a debate with Cenk Uygur, and he said, some of these super pro business policies, I don't know, maybe they're not too great. So do you think that's a potential conflict on the right?
Well, Tucker Carlson has said another interesting thing, and he's not the first one to have said it, is that if you give the average American a choice between kind of hardline Randian, Rothbardian, Cato Institute economic domestic policy, or run-of-the-mill big government liberalism, they're going to take the big government liberalism. So we live in a democracy. The people vote. They express their preferences. They like Social Security. They like Medicare. They are, and I sympathize with them, they feel unease about the churning of capitalism. The wonders of capitalism come from the churning, the creative disruption, the innovation. But it is deeply unsettling. And people are by nature conservative. And so the challenge is to think about this in a way where you preserve the magic of markets, the awesome powers they have to generate innovation, prosperity, while making an allowance for the fact that the people do not want free market fundamentalism. And that if you give them a choice between free market fundamentalism and democratic socialism, I suspect they will pick democratic socialism. Yes? What time do we?
One more.
Okay, you get the last question.
Okay, so I'm currently working on an independent study that's kind of looking at some of these things, particularly in terms of the wealth distribution in America and the perceptions of the reason why some people are completely okay with it. They think it's great. They think it's a symbol of upward mobility. Other people have a very negative opinion. Some of the progressives, the identity politics, and even the populists, if you have less, there's someone to blame for why someone else has more globalism, who you are on an identity basis, or the elite, the 1%, whatever. Do you have anything to say about possibly the sorting mechanism that puts people in a positive and negative favor of the wealth distribution?
No. No. But I will, I haven't studied that question. Let me end on a positive note. What I think we should all be deeply concerned with as Americans, or as in my case, Canadians who aspire to become Americans, is to use a word that is not very common in traditional American politics, and that's solidarity. It doesn't come naturally to us in America to use this language, especially not on the right, but I think it's a term that should resonate very much with both the left and the right, is that at the end of the day, we're all in this together, we're all Americans, and we should try to attenuate some of these divisions. You will never eliminate them. I mean, the essence of politics in a free country is to have disagreements. We yearn for unity Aristotle says this in the Politics, you're just not going to get it. In a free society, you will have contentious disagreements, but that I think it's important to remember to try to emphasize solidarity with one's fellow citizens. And on this jovial note, I will end. Thank you very much.